That was nice. I thought you were going to do the, like what was it? The pogo stick one. The one after the sploosh. The woo.
How about?
Nice. Really nice. Hello and welcome back to the Brain Fart Podcast. I'm Sean. I'm joined, as always, by my brother Matt.
Hello, everyone.
Last week was, we were talking about university, having the right attitude and all that funky goodness. This week was going to be the Joker film and sort of the DCEU and how that's going. We pushed that back a week because Mike wanted to be involved. We're not currently sure whether he'll be able to make it yet, but hopefully, fingers crossed.
We're hoping Mike can talk about the Joker film.
Yeah,
because I don't know that much about films.
Well, I was sort of thinking it would be strange to do an episode on a film without the person who is most into film out of all three of us.
But you'll be here.
What?
But you'll be here.
No, that's not me. That's Mike.
Oh.
Yeah, Mike's more into film than I am. So how are you, Matt?
That was me direct addressing the camera.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
For future, I'm practicing. Getting the practice in now.
Yeah.
How am I? Yeah, I'm good. I finally got some time without assignments. I've basically done all my assignments that I'll have to do at home now.
Nice.
So I have one more assignment this week, but that will be done in class.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm free. Just exams. Got 3 exams. Then I'll be done. And
you'll be done for like January, won't you?
Yeah, January the 17th. I think is my last exam. So
So you'll finish just as I go back after Christmas.
Yeah.
I think it's the 17th or 16th, one of those two.
Well, I think the 17th is a Friday.
Yeah, and then you'll be looking for jobs, right? Or PhDs.
For a little while. Well, my PhD applications will start in the next week or so.
Right. And then you'll find out what roughly start next year.
I'll have to do interviews and stuff. So just
so
whenever
the next year we'll be doing all that stuff, right?
Well, the thing that a lot of students don't understand is that obviously you go from school where realistically most people just go to the school in the catchment area. Probably like either sixth form or college, where people will either stay at their own school if they've got a sixth form attached, or they'll go to sort of the city college and study there.
The closest.
University is very much the same sort of thing. Like it feels like you're applying for an education position rather than like a job, for example. Same with like masters. It's still very much like, if you've got the right qualifications and the space, and they've got the space, then they'll take you on.
Yeah.
Whereas with a PhD, obviously, it's very much like one position for one person.
Yes. So it's so special.
It's like a job. It's like applying for a job.
It's going into the first step of the career that you want to pursue, right?
Yeah.
That's how I'd see it.
Yeah. So I'll hear back when they fill the position.
Really nice. Yeah. Are you excited to go and go to the cinema for the first time in like ages? Because you don't do that very often.
It's the last film I went to see.
I don't even know what that was.
No idea.
No.
Got no idea.
Mine was Joker. I've already seen it, but we're going to see it again. This will be the 3rd time I've seen it. Seen it twice.
No, it'll be interesting. Like I think we've already said on the podcast at some point. I think that obviously its relationship to the Batman universe is a bit strange for me. Like I think obviously we've talked about the point of the Joker and how he's basically chaos. Like he doesn't need a backstory.
Yeah, it very much is a story not about the Joker with the Joker skin on it, if you will.
Yeah. Exactly. It's just got the name.
Yes.
So whether it would have been better to sort of call it. Imagine if they'd have called it The Jester, and it was a film about a different guy, but it's kind of loosely based on the character from the Batman films, because then it's not like directly related, but inspired by. I think that maybe would have been a better way to go. We'll see though. We'll see what I think about it.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. And I think with me, if you and Mike end up all talking about it, I think we'll each have very different things to say about it.
Different perspectives.
Yeah. More update on the podcasting studio. We're currently in there now. We have a table. It doesn't look like a crack den anymore. We've got wallpaper.
Some wallpaper.
It's not quite finished yet. But it's looking good. It's looking really good. So
I would say so. We've done some test footage.
Yeah, we still have a few things to sort out. The main one being cameras. We still need to work out the sort of cameras we want to get, how we want to go about, whether we want to live stream from the start or whether we want to pre-record episodes first.
Yeah.
But we're certainly well on track to get there by sort of late January, like the plan was.
Yeah. So expect our faces on your screen soon enough.
Soon, in the next few months.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
So instead of the Joker, today we're going to be talking about the brain,
Brian.
its structures, its functions, and its history. The brain is obviously the main thing that we're both into, right? In terms of our fields, you can link them via the brain. I'm obviously about the mind. You're about the effects drugs can have on the brain and stuff like that. But the linking thing is the brain and the mind, right?
Yeah. Well, I think obviously the brain plays a massive part in cognition, but specifically, I would say that I'm interested in cognition, and the more we, well, I think there's no way
cognition
to look at the brain.
being the actual mental processes, right?
Cognition being cognition is basically high function, so emotions and basically conscious actions.
Yeah.
So something that I think is a poignant thing to mention is that you don't have cognition without the rest of the body as well.
Yeah.
So while the brain's probably the most important thing, obviously you couldn't have cognition without the brain. If you had a body without a brain, you couldn't have cognition. If you had a brain without a body,
You still couldn't.
You probably couldn't have cognition because you need inputs, and that's where and I think there's probably as I was reading a paper, and I was reading an abstract recently where a group had basically found that like dendrites have all the way along them rather than just in neurons. The soma all the way along them actually have processing capabilities. So all the way along the dendrite.
Oh, okay. So as soon as the information hits the neuron, before it's even reached the cell body, i.e. the soma, it's already processing that information.
Yeah.
Right. And then presumably it goes to the cell body and it's done properly, if that makes sense, or finished, or done in more detail.
I think it probably it potentially provides more of a role for the soma in terms of then organization and orchestration of where the signal goes next, rather than necessarily actually processing in the soma. And obviously that sort of ties into what I was saying before. If the dendrites are processing units of their own right, then all of a sudden you have this idea that like, oh, there's much more than just the brain going on, because there's potentially processing going on all over the body,
microprocessors and stuff like that.
Exactly.
If you don't know what a neuron looks like or the sort of function of a neuron, either give it a Google or there's a drawing I did on the Instagram, so go and have a look at that. That's labelled with all the functions of the parts, or all the basic functions of the parts labelled. But I think were you going to say something? No, okay. But it seems to me that humans have always been fascinated by the mind and intelligence. As long as 2,000 years ago, the rulers of China were conducting the first... Were you going to do the Donald Trump? Go on.
We'll be talking to China.
China.
We've
got to build a wall.
It's going to be the best wall.
That was actually quite good for you.
Nice.
Impressive. So 2,000 years ago, the rulers of China were conducting the first psychological and personality and intelligence tests. Sorry. So as time goes on, we've not always got things right though, as we've been trying to understand where consciousness lays and where it stems from and all that.
Do you have any idea what they were doing in China?
At the time, what sort of tests?
Yeah.
Beyond the fact that they were personality intelligence tests, I'm not sure. I would guess it's sort of like examinations like
crude IQ tests.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So if we go to around 350 BC, Aristotle, he believed that the heart was the center of consciousness, not the brain, which sort of makes sense. You can understand that in terms of that's roughly the center of the person, right? So with the limited knowledge they had at the time, you can understand where he's coming from. But his mentor, Plato, he believed it was the brain. And I find that fascinating that as long ago as that, someone still managed to get it right.
Yeah, I think, if it sort of obviously depends. It's quite easy for us to say now, like, oh, if you think about it in this way, then it becomes obvious like that. I think the big thing is obviously there you're looking at the two paradigms. The conflicting paradigms there are centralized control, which would be the heart, and obviously I think the opposing paradigm is localization for functional importance. So what I mean by that is obviously the eyes are in the head, the ears are in the head, the mouth
Nose
in the head,
mouth.
Exactly, which are, fair enough, like you've got tactile sensation all throughout your body, but
but the only sense really that isn't on your head is your hands, because that's the primary piece of your body that you touch the world with, right?
And I would argue that actually that is in your head, because touch is the touch organ is skin. It's not your hands.
Yeah. It just so happens that we have extremities that are primarily used. Otherwise, we'd be rubbing our faces on things.
Well, you actually get. Do you know what a topographic map is?
No. I've heard it mentioned on Deadpool, but I don't know what it is.
Right. So a topographic map in terms of the brain. Topography is basically. I always describe it as looking at the lay of the land. So it's like the way. When related to the brain, it's the way structures and functions are organized to then produce the outcome.
Right.
So, for example, if you look at a topographic map of the somatosensory cortex, so let's just call it the touch region of the brain.
Yep.
Rather, obviously, there's motor regions in the somatosensory, but let's just call it the touch regions of the brain. What you would see is, a lot of neurons dedicated to touch in the hands. Mm-hmm. Not so many dedicated to touch on the arms.
Like the back of the elbow, for example.
Exactly.
You can squeeze your elbow and you don't feel pain.
So what you've seen there is actually differences in the topography of the brain for touch.
Right.
It's not necessarily that your hands, and that's, it's actually a very poignant point that you would go to, your hands are your touch organs.
Yeah.
Because they're actually not, they're just, in terms of the importance of touch sensation, tactile sensation, heavily weighted towards the hands.
Yes.
Same with like the lips are very much as well. Mm-hmm. But that's why. So it's not necessarily that it's the hands are far away from the brain and it's the whole skin.
Yes.
The whole skin is innervated for touch.
Yeah, and that's obviously all over the body.
Yeah, exactly.
So skipping ahead from 350 BC to the 1800s, as I'm sure you can imagine, there weren't many advances in understanding these things until we had better technology, which will have started around the 1800s.
Yeah, a big part of the, obviously sort of from 350 BC to the world wasn't very advanced for one, and secondly,
you had religion in the way as well.
Religion, international conflicts. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of empires that were rising and falling in that time.
Yes.
So it's not really surprising that we've dragged our feet through that time.
Yeah. So roughly the 1800s, a man named Franz Josef Gall. Do you know who that is? What was he?
An idiot.
Yes. So he was the first phrenologist, and phrenology is essentially the notion that you can use the size and shape of the cranium, so the skull, to determine character and mental ability.
So it's sort of like palm reading, but for your head. Yeah.
So as incredibly wrong as that is, at least they're focusing in on the head.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
I find it funny imagining him rubbing a clearly mental person's head and going, yeah, you're definitely mental. Yes, for sure.
I think that's the weirdest. Maybe he just had a head fetish.
Maybe, yeah. Maybe he just loved rubbing people's heads.
You never know.
I think he was at least balding as well, so maybe that explains his obsession with heads.
He just really wanted to touch people's hair.
Yeah. I think we've sussed it. It's so furry. Phineas Gage, who we mentioned last week.
Oh, yeah, we did.
Briefly, and I said I didn't want to talk about it until this episode.
Yeah.
In 1848, he was a foreman on a railroad, and he tapped gunpowder into holes to I'm not actually sure what the purpose was. I think maybe it was to blow space for railroads to be laid or something like that.
Pretty much. I believe it was for the they have spikes basically that hold the slats in.
Yes.
And I think it was
to anchor them.
Exactly. I think that's what it was.
Yeah. That's not really important.
No.
It's
neither here nor there.
And an accidental explosion shot the rod through his head, so through his jaw and out through the top of his head, which destroyed more or less all of his left frontal lobe. We'll talk about the lobes in a little while.
Would you say it was through his jaw? I think it was more through his cheek.
It didn't hit his cheek. It was underneath his jawbone.
Okay.
Yeah. But he miraculously got up straight afterwards. Was treated by a doctor, and went on to live a longer life than you'd expect. He was more or less unchanged.
And the chunks of frontal lobe remain on the tracks to this day.
Go and dig them up, ladies and gentlemen. But after the accident, he was psychologically changed. People described him as no longer Gage. He was rude, he was vulgar, when before he was soft-spoken and kind. One thing I'd say about that is that personality change could be explained by him feeling hard done to after his accident. I think if you lost an eye and you had a rod shoot through your head and maybe couldn't work because of illness or whatever it may be, I think you would be a significantly more intolerant person of the world around you.
I think the biggest one, though, what I would argue is, it's not necessarily, the reports weren't necessarily that he was just less tolerant. It was in the way he was less tolerant as well. So it was in the language that he used.
Yes,
and
he started swearing a lot. And
exactly,
stuff like that. Yeah.
Exactly. I think, if I was the kind of person who didn't swear that much and I was wound up by something,
you still wouldn't necessarily swear.
Yeah, it would probably be.
You'd vent frustration in other ways.
Yeah.
Or it was obviously due to the severe damage to his brain. That itself is a case study, which aren't incredibly useful because they're isolated incidents. So you can't generalize it to the wider population. You can't say, if I shot a rod through your head and it destroyed a large part of the left frontal lobe, you could be brain dead. You can't necessarily transfer that information and generalize it. But the important part of this was the fact that it was the first hard evidence of the brain being the center of mental function.
Actually, not only that, I believe, though I could be wrong, but I think I'm right. It's actually the first evidence of localized function in the brain as well.
In terms of personality aspects, being in the frontal lobe.
Exactly, because he's only lost one.
Yeah, he can't not hear anymore. He can't not see anymore.
Exactly.
The hippocampus wasn't damaged, so he could still form memories.
Exactly. Which I think leads us on to
one more point, and then
okay.
So once, or this is more the linking point, the segue. So once people realised the true purpose of the brain, specific localized function became the centre of attention, which leads us on to, as you quite rightly say, Matthew, Henry Molaison. Molaison?
I would say Malaise. It looks French.
Molaison.
I don't know. Molaison.
Henry Molaison. I think he was American, but maybe French by heritage. Yeah. So he suffered from epilepsy as a child, potentially due to a head injury he went through when he was around 2 or 3. When he was age 16, they became particularly severe, and by the age 27, he could no longer work due to these seizures. He was referred to a doctor who decided to undergo an extremely experimental procedure. You'd not heard of this man, had you?
Nope.
And the doctor proceeded to essentially suck out his hippocampus with a metal straw.
Delicious.
One interesting note is the doctor eventually died due to ingesting this brain matter over a long period of time.
Do you know what the cause of death was?
I don't.
So,
some sort of poisoning from something.
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether the fact that you say metal straw, I'm wondering whether they've used some kind of lead compound in the straw.
That's a good shout.
There's not that much in the brain that would necessarily kill you on its own.
Yeah.
On its own.
Yeah. I was explaining this to Elle the other day, and she asked why he would do it with a straw rather than using a scalpel, and that's obviously because there are all these cerebral areas on the top of the brain that you can't get past. Yeah. So you stick a straw through not the gyri, what are the... Sulci. Sulci. S-U-L-C-I or something like that. So you'd stick that through there and do your business, etc., etc.
Do your business in the brain.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. So after the procedure, Malazan, I'm going to pretend he's French.
He's French now.
Had severe memory loss. He could remember much of his childhood and a lot of the things that led up to the surgery itself. Yeah. But due to the loss of his hippocampus, which is obviously the centre of memory formation, he was unable to form new memories.
Something interesting about that is actually, so at one point people thought that the hippocampus was actually just the sole memory storage system.
So if you lost it, you would be like a vegetable. You'd lose all your memories. Exactly. And you couldn't form new ones.
Well, not only that, think about it. How do you know how to tie your shoes?
Motor patterns and stuff like that.
Exactly, that's a memory.
Yeah,
that's a memory. So if
you'd be useless, you wouldn't be able to speak, move, or anything like that.
Yeah, so if the hippocampus was the sole area of memory in the brain, if it was the only thing that really contributed to memory, then you wouldn't be able to remember motor patterns, you wouldn't be able to walk properly.
You'd be useless. Yes. You'd be able to move, but that would just be like, there would be no flow to it.
It would be almost like...
seizure.
Probably not Parkinson's, but close to that.
Something
sort
like
of,
that, yeah. I find it a bit of a shame that such a huge discovery for the human race as a whole resulted in someone essentially being left in the dark for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like we did that to find out the purpose of the hippocampus.
Yes, they were trying to help him.
Yes, but I do think it's a shame, to know that man wasn't in any pain for the rest of his life, but was a shell of who he should or could have been.
Yeah, I think that it's a really interesting point. Even on my course, you'll have people. But bearing in mind, this is a neuropharmacology course. This is a course
master's level
related to a field whereby the number one method of learning things is administering drugs to animals, killing them, and seeing what happens.
To their brain, you mean? Checking their brain?
Anything.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends. So let's say you might infect a mouse with cancer, as one example, and give then a cancer drug, and then cut them open and have a look at the tumour, image the tumour, stuff like that. See if it's
reduced or...
yeah, so you raise an interesting point with your... there's not anything you can do about... you're going to hurt people. You're going to hurt animals. You don't have a choice. You don't have a choice.
If you want knowledge... I don't really want to use this phrase, but to make an omelette, you have to break a few eggs.
Yeah, right.
There's always going to be negatives to positive achievements, isn't
right? And it's a really interesting point. Like I say, there are a lot of people on my course who are very against animal testing.
Right.
Very against stuff like that. But
it's one of those things.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you can't create a model of the brain until you understand it well enough to create a model of the brain. So it's like you've just said, it's just one of those things. You don't really. That's how you learn things.
Yeah.
It's like you say. It's thankful that they weren't going in. It's not anti-ethical.
Exactly. Yeah. So to move on to the lobes of the brain. Lobes of the brain. Delicious. So this would obviously be easier if we were video podcasting already, because I could show, for example, the brain poster that you got me, and sort of highlight where the lobes are. But to sort of remedy this, I'm going to highlight the thumbnail on the screen. So if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify or anything like that, this won't be helpful. But if you're listening on YouTube, then take a look at the screen, and I'm going to highlight each lobe as we talk about them. So
in before, this is the most popular video on YouTube, because the people who watch on Spotify, listen on Spotify and iTunes, go to the YouTube just to see this.
So to start with occipital, if anyone's ever used the Oculus Rift, the VR headset, you could probably work out what that is. It's information related to sight. This is at the back of the brain. That's easy to remember. Just it's on the opposite side to the eyes. Not much else to say about that. It just processes sight, essentially.
Yeah. That's. Well, I mean, it does a few. You know, the thing about the brain is obviously as you're going through this, all of these regions, while they're mainly specialized to one function,
The brain.
they do everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
The brain all communicates with each other to work as a whole to produce these things.
It's like the Broca's areas. They're just dotted all the way through all around the brain. I think they're related to speech.
Right. Yes, that is correct.
And they're dotted all over the place in the brain.
Yeah. On the top, you have your parietal lobes. This is sensory information and body position, things like that. So presumably, when you close your eyes and hold your arm in a certain position, and you can sense where your arm is, despite not really being able to feel where your arm is or see where your arm is, that's why you can do that.
Proprioception, that's called. Yeah, because we don't just have.
It is a
senses.
sense, isn't it?
Proprioception. Yeah. We don't just have 5 senses.
Yeah.
We have it's like 8 or
Quite
9,
a
maybe
few,
something. Yeah.
But the other ones are sort of more obscure and related to oddly specific things, right?
Yeah.
At the front, what lobes do you have at the front, Matt?
The backwards lobe.
You have the frontal lobes.
What?
Yeah,
That
I know, that doesn't make sense at all. So these are the more complex functions. So you have concentration, personality aspects, your inhibitions, speech, things like that.
Yeah, higher cognitive functions.
Yes, exactly.
Emotion. Things that you're choosing to do. Voluntary actions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you have the temporal lobes, which are on the side, close to the ears. Why are they close to the ears?
Because they like to listen.
Yes, they love to listen to the ears, or something along those lines. No, they deal with speech comprehension, so understanding speech that is coming into you. The frontal do you giving out speech, and the temporal deal with you receiving speech.
Yeah. I always think it's... Sorry, go on.
And
finish your point.
sound.
Yeah. So I always think it's really interesting that... so obviously the temporal lobe. What does temporal mean?
Time.
Okay. So I always find it really interesting. We've spoke about this before.
We have.
The ears are the same region that looks after the way you hear things is also the same region that is calculating how much time has gone past.
Yes.
I find that really interesting because of the prevalence of rhythm in music.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, say you're in a room or in any location without sound. You're not making any sound and no one else is making sound. It'd be hard to judge how much time has passed that you've been doing that for, right? Whereas if you've got music playing or birds chirping, you're gonna have a better estimation of that.
There's a reference point.
Yeah, that'd be a really interesting experiment to do, actually. Have people sit in silence and estimate the length of time. We'll have to look into that.
Anechoic chambers and stuff now. That'd be really cool. So an anechoic chamber is basically...
Soundproof rooms or...
Well, literally, so they are so soundproof that they actually have negative decibels.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so effectively you go in them and there is no sound. All the sound that gets made is absorbed immediately.
Right.
You can obviously speak, but there's no reverberations off the walls or anything like that. It's all just absorbed.
So you can hear the sound waves going from your mouth to your ear, but
That's it.
That's it. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Apparently it's really unsettling to be in. And I would imagine potentially
I can understand
some
that.
kind of relationship to time going by. And I mean, in fact, I've watched a video, I can't remember what his name is. Rob Stallon.
Right.
Rob Scallon, that's it. That's right. Rob Scallon, not Rob Stallon. And him and a few musicians went up to this anechoic chamber in, I think it was somewhere in Switzerland, but it's been a while since I've watched it, so I could be wrong there. And that's one of the things that they were saying. I think they ended up being in there at one point for 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. And they said after they came out and they were sort of talking about the experience, they were saying, it's really difficult to gauge how long you've been in this for. So they were saying they'd been in there for 15 minutes and it maybe felt like an hour or a couple of hours.
Right. That's really interesting because that's a very dramatic difference between perceived time and actual time.
Yeah, exactly.
So now that we've gone through the lobes themselves, the reason I wanted to do those first is because, as I was saying to you earlier, if people don't have an understanding of brain structures, then when you picture a brain, the outer cerebral parts, i.e. where the lobes are and everything like that, that's what you imagine. So people can integrate it into their knowledge easier than the structures within the brain, within the centre of the brain. So onto brain structures themselves, which are the things that you don't see unless you dissect or have some sort of MRI.
Yeah, inner structures then.
Yes, that's right.
Structures, yeah.
So we start with the brain stem. This anchors the brain, and it's the sort of central core where the spinal cord enters the skull. So that's where obviously all the signals go down your spine and stuff like that.
Yeah, also the blood-brain barrier.
Yes. Yeah. Above it sits the medulla.
Yeah.
Would you call it medulla or medulla?
Medulla.
Medulla.
I would say.
Medulla. I'm thinking Dark Souls, medulla.
Okay.
The medulla deals with unconscious function. So things like breathing, digestion, blood circulation, respiration.
Or unconscious vital functions, I would say.
Yes.
It's all, they're not...
yeah, because I suppose walking can be an unconscious function.
It is, yeah. Same with what we were talking about earlier, tying your shoelace.
Yeah. With that, you have the pons, which is sort of some sensory stuff, so hearing and taste.
Tiny little button.
Your balance, and it partially deals with communication across the brain itself. But that's not the main thing that does that. At the top of the brainstem, we have the thalamus, which is a pair of egg-shaped structures which take in sensory information, so seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, etc. This next part we spoke about last week, the corpus callosum. This connects the two brain hemispheres. Do you mind going over what you talked about last time, just in case people haven't heard it? Because it's a very, very interesting piece of information.
Yeah, so effectively the corpus callosum, one of its functions is to mediate communication between the different hemispheres. Obviously, there are effects of localization between the two hemispheres. So although the brain is somewhat symmetrical, it's not really in terms of the way they function. And a lot of people probably will have heard that sort of the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. It's not that simple, but it's a good way to get into that
understand.
Sort of thing.
Yeah.
So corpus callosum is this piece of tissue that connects the right and left hemisphere. There have been I don't know whether it's a number of, but I certainly know of one case whereby effectively it used to be a treatment of seizures, whereby you would have these seizures, and effectively the treatment was to sever the corpus callosum, which effectively would end up isolating these pieces of excitatory tissue, hyperexcitatory tissue. The interesting thing about it is what ended up happening was you would end up with either, sometimes there would be, to the person, involuntary actions on one side of the body. Or there would be you would maybe develop multiple personalities.
Yes.
The interesting thing about that, obviously, is when you think about localization of function and you think about the fact that regions of the brain are specialized in terms of what they do, and then you look at, okay, so if you sever this region that's helping the two hemispheres communicate, then you get these effects whereby there's something that isn't you, in inverted commas, performing actions with your body.
And the way you sort of described it last week was the potential of having little pockets of consciousness.
Yeah, I call them islands of consciousness.
Yeah.
So whereby not only might you see that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are actually separate islands of consciousness. So effectively, it's kind of hard to explain, but effectively that they have the same thing that you have, but you can't access that. So they're thinking things, for want of a better word. They're considering different possibilities related to their function. And it's really interesting because, especially when you look at how specialized certain brain regions are, if that's true, if that's a hypothesis that is in any way true to some extent, then there could be, so many different consciousnesses in the brain where they're all separated and contributing to your main consciousness, but exactly. You can't actually access them.
The individual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You also have the cerebellum. So this sticks out from the base of the brainstem. And that's sort of responsible for non-verbal learning and memory. So I guess that could be things like tying your shoelace and things like that. Just things sticking in your mind where you don't consciously think of or know about them, but they're there.
Yeah.
And that's why when Henry Molaison lost his memory, they asked him to do a task where he was asked to trace a star where he could only see what he was doing in a mirror. Okay, so as he was doing this, he did it multiple times.
I've heard this.
And he got better at it, which shows that he's still he's still learning.
It's procedural memory, yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. In fact, did he lose old memories, or was it just memory formation that he lost?
Just memory formation he lost, yeah. He can remember the name of the doctor who performed the procedure because he met him beforehand.
Yeah, right.
Everything up to the procedure. Right. He can sort of remember some things are a bit foggy or were a bit foggy because he's dead now.
Obviously.
Yeah. It's the cerebellum is also responsible for perception of time, emotion control, and voluntary movement. This is the part of the brain that is easily impaired by alcohol, which is why you get really drunk. You struggle with memory. You can get blackout drunk. You can't always perceive time accurately. You can get very emotional, angry or sad or happy, etc., etc. The amygdala. So this is 2 clusters of neurons, right? The amygdala is, I believe so. It is. This is responsible for memory and emotion, memory consolidation and emotion. Is. So this is where you'll find your biggest fear and your biggest aggression, things like that. This is the thing that says, or doesn't really say, makes you go, that's a nasty thing, run. Yeah. But just in a split second.
So interesting.
Fight or flight and things like that.
Yeah, so super interesting that you talk about memory as well. Some of the work that I've been doing this year has been related to
learning and memory.
Yeah. So specifically, one of my colleagues was working on the effect of cortisol on memory formation.
What is cortisol?
A stress hormone.
Okay.
So in times of, most of the time it's physiological stress. When we talk about stress in biology, we talk about physiological stress. So we talk about injury, we talk about things like that, rather than, you can raise cortisol with emotional stress, but it takes a more chronic stressor, and it's a more chronic upregulation of cortisol because it's a hormone rather than it being like a neurotransmitter.
Yes. The hormones work slower but last longer, right?
Yes, that's correct.
They leave more lasting effects.
That's correct. So interesting. Obviously, cortisol, basically what my colleague found was that cortisol can effectively, it reinforces the memory that you're forming at the time. So
you're more likely to remember things that happen to you when you're stressed,
in
mainly
danger.
Physiologically stressed.
In danger, in pain.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Obviously, the function of
and
that
does make sense. That has an actual use for it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because obviously you need to, things that can hurt you are far more important to remember than things that are good for you. Because
do you think cortisol would explain how some people act better under stress? Something like that, like a more alertness or something like that.
It wouldn't necessarily be cortisol that would explain that.
But the effects of cortisol or something.
It would probably be something to do with the system, yeah. It could be something to do with the... I'm trying to remember the name. No, I can't remember the name.
Right.
The cortisol system.
Yeah.
And how that's processed and how it's dealt with, rather than necessarily it being cortisol itself, because everyone has a cortisol response.
Yes.
It could be that the cortisol response is less, they're more resilient in times of stress, in terms of the cortisol release. It could be something downstream. So by downstream, I mean, obviously cortisol binds to a cortisol receptor. In fact, it causes gene transcription. It's
gene transcription.
Yes, yeah. So cortisol gets into a cell, binds to the cortisol receptor, which effectively allows transcription of downstream genes. So anytime we talk about downstream in terms of genes, in terms of biological processes, downstream means in the future, upstream means in the past.
Oh, okay.
So it could be things that are downstream of the cortisol. It could be, things that are upstream of the cortisol, then preventing the cortisol release or things like that.
Right.
It could be any number of factors. You would have to interrogate the system
to work
certain
out specifically
exactly
what's happening.
Exactly.
There. So we talked about the thalamus a few minutes ago. You also have the hypothalamus. So this is it's mainly sort of body regulation, right? Dealing with the regulation of certain systems. So you have regulation of body temperature, hunger. So presumably the hypothalamus is responsible for, well, yes, it governs the endocrine system, so the glands, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that it is responsible for regulating hunger, it would release ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone. It is a hormone.
Yeah. Ghrelin and leptin, both of them hormones.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it also deals with your pleasure and reward system, so dopaminergic systems and things like that.
Mesolimbic pathway, mesocortical pathway, yeah.
Right. But that's really all that does. It's quite important because it deals with the endocrine system, like I say, which is your glands, which release hormones.
Yeah, the way to think about hormones is neurotransmitters are quick, and they are, because of that, quite crude. They're susceptible to very slight variations in things like concentration or receptor density. Hormones are there to fine-tune that system. So you get to a ballpark with your neurotransmitters and other systems, and then your hormones...
your neurotransmitters get you roughly in where you're supposed to be, and the hormones then go, okay, this needs dealing with a little bit, this isn't quite how it needs to be, etc. So talking about glands, the most important gland, arguably, I don't think it's really arguably, certainly not the way I've been taught it, is that the pituitary gland is the most important gland in the endocrine system. So this deals with the release of growth hormones. So it's very important for children as they're getting older. And it also releases oxytocin, which is a love hormone.
Releases a lot of hormones, actually, the pituitary.
Oh yeah, sure. But they're probably the main two, aren't they? They're the only two that I've been taught about.
Well, yeah, really.
So oxytocin, the love hormone, is responsible for sort of inducing feelings of social bonding and stuff like that.
Orgasm, things like that.
Yeah. As we spoke about earlier, you also have the hippocampus, which, as we've spoken about, is central to learning and memory. That's more or less all there is to say about the hippocampus as far as I'm aware. Yeah,
delicious image of a mouse hippocampus on the Instagram if you want to check that out.
Go and check that out. It's really interesting, actually. So wherever there is blue dye, that's the hippocampus, right?
It's stained. Is
it neurons?
Neurons are stained.
Yes.
I believe it's a nuclear stain, thymine. So
the curled shape is the hippocampus,
yes,
right?
So there's effectively what you're looking at. It looks kind of like a bracket that's been stretched out at the top.
Almost like a cochlea shape, something like that. Yeah. This slight snail shape.
Yeah. That's the hippocampus. Yeah. In the middle of the image, there's this. It's really clear. You won't miss it. You can see the border on the edge where the edge of the neurons is. Yeah.
You obviously have some other stained blue bits, but that's just where other neuronal things are, right?
Yeah, look, the whole thing is stained blue. The really dense, curvy line in the middle, that's the hippocampus.
Yeah. Finally, we have the cerebrum, so the outer layers of the brain. This is what we spoke about when we were talking about the lobes. So
frontal lobes, specifically.
Yes.
Actually all of them.
It's just the outside region of the brain, the exterior. So this is what we see when we picture the brain. And this deals with more complex, typically human, what are considered human functions, right?
Yeah,
so
to
think, to speak, to perceive.
Yeah, I would just correct that to things that we consider are unique to humans.
Uniquely human processes.
Yeah. But might not necessarily be.
Yes. As you said earlier, while functions are localized to certain regions of the brain, the entire brain works together to manage all of these functions together. Yeah. So while you can go, this is central to learning and memory, the hippocampus is central to learning and memory, the frontal lobes are abstract thoughts and complex processes. All of the brain works together to deal with all of this at the same time. It's both localized and generalized in different ways, right?
Yeah, so you said essential there. and I think that's a really key point to mention. So we have this concept of essential and sufficient. Okay, so an area that's essential to a function, let's say memory. So let's take, it was Malaison. Let's take Malaison. Lost his hippocampus, then could no longer form memories. So what we would say there is the hippocampus is essential to memory.
Yes.
So that means that if you lose your hippocampus or if you lose functioning in your hippocampus, you can no longer form memories.
Yeah.
Now, something that's sufficient would be something that, let's say...
Say maybe there's a specific part of the hippocampus that you remove. That would be sufficient in learning
But
memory.
depending on the effects,
Yes.
yeah. So you would say if you removed one area of the brain and you let's keep it in memory, and you could still form memories, and then you removed another area of the brain and then you couldn't, but then if you did it the other way around, so you removed the first area and then you still could, then both of those areas are sufficient but not essential for memory formation.
Yes.
Because you can do it with one, you can do it with the other, but you can't do it without both. And that's a really important concept in brain function, because it allows you to look at, like we were talking about, the fact that, you know, while it does localized function, actually the whole brain sort of works in concert to produce cognition. So you can make judgments about which parts of the brain are really key to a function and which parts of the brain are just contributing.
Could you correct me quite quickly if this isn't a good analogy, but could you relate it to a car, to a car's... there are obviously some parts of a car that you just don't need, and there are some parts of a car that are essential, but it all works together to produce the whole machine of the car.
Yeah, so let's take that analogy a bit further. Let's make it a little bit more specific so that you can really justify it. Let's take a four-wheeled car and let's take a Reliant Robin. So a four-wheel car versus a three-wheel car.
Yeah.
That fourth wheel is sufficient to travel, but it's not essential, because you remove that, and fair enough, you're moving the structure around a bit, but just forget that for a minute. It's not essential to function because you can do it with three wheels. Now, let's say the steering wheel, you remove the steering wheel, all of a sudden you can't turn.
Yeah, the function of the car is
exactly,
not usable.
Exactly. So the steering wheel would be essential to change a direction, but not. It would be sufficient and essential.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how I would move that analogy.
Yeah. That's more or less all I've got on structures of the brain. Is there anything else that you think I've missed? I think we've probably covered everything that you'd need to know if you're a beginner in understanding brain structures and stuff like that. I think there are obviously many more systems and many more specific things, but I think to go in more detail than this now would be a bit silly, because I don't want people getting a bit overwhelmed with information and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's like I was saying to you earlier. You know, you could talk about how the brain works all day, every day.
Yeah,
for
there's so much
a
stuff.
week.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, you know, obviously we've been looking at structural aspects of the brain and then the function of that structure. What you have to bear in mind, you know, if you're really interested in something like this, what you have to bear in mind is that it's not just the tissue, you know. Each tissue has a population of cells, each with, you know, unique structures in and of themselves, specialized to where they are. So, you know, you can look at the brain as this big organ of tissues that are connected to one another, but actually on a smaller scale, what you have to think about it is cells that are communicating with one another, and not just a tissue.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of complexity in the brain. You go down one more level than that, than cells, and you get molecular interactions and effects on, you know, you could talk about DNA transcription regulation and stuff like this. That's what, you know, a lot of my project was about, molecular interactions and seeing what cells do with certain molecules when you give them to them. But in terms of physiology, and then relating physiology to function and structure, I think that's pretty comprehensive as an introduction. Yeah.
Like the rest of the world, you can keep going further and further into detail and looking closer and closer and closer, and things get more and more complex. But that's just sort of like a brief intro to the brain, its history, and some of the main functions. I'm sure we'll go more into detail in the future, both when I understand more and when it seems appropriate. Next time we'll be talking about the Joker, hopefully with Mike. We'll see whether he's available. We're obviously going to go see it the day that this episode uploads, so if you watch it on the day that this episode uploads, picture us sitting in the cinema having a good time. If you made it to the end of this episode, thank you for watching. I hope this has been a more informative episode than some of the previous ones. This is obviously the first neurology episode where we're really talking about something that involves our interest directly, right?
That involves
we've touched
academic education. Right?
Absolutely. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week.
Or listening. And if you want to know what we think about the Joker film, especially me, because my opinion's more important because I watch so many films,
then
tune
in
next
time
to
find out.